You giggle at the front of that there. Good evening, everyone. I love Appliqué. It is my second favorite thing to do with software, and often, as I will tonight, I combine it with my first love, text. First, let's make sure everyone knows what we mean when we talk about a machine embroidery applique design. It is generally a design with a large area, sometimes too large for a fill stitch. It's covered with a piece of fabric, which is then trimmed to size and finished on the edge with some type of stitch. These pictures are from one of my books with Dime, Welcome Baby. In fact, almost all of the projects in both of my books with Dime have applique designs in some of those areas. I'd like to show you the steps involved with an applique, so you have a reference point when we create an applique in the software. We begin by hooping the appropriate stabilizer for the project. In this case, the red is just cotton, a quality cotton, and I would have tearaway hooped with that fabric. The first thing to stitch is going to be the applique position, and you can see it right here done in black thread. You would then lay a prepared piece of fabric on top of the applique position, large enough to cover the entire outline. By prepared, I mean that a double-sided fusible web has been fused to the wrong side of the applique fabric, and then when that piece is cooled totally, you would remove the paper backing. I try to prepare all of my applique fabrics before I begin the embroidery project so everything is ready to go. The next stitch to happen is the applique tack down. You can see it here in white, and it tacks down or anchors our applique fabric to the focus fabric. You can tell that it's the same shape that was done up here for the applique position, and it's done again on that applique fabric. You would then remove the hoop from the machine, place it on a flat surface, not your lap. Trim very close to the stitching line with a small curved tip scissors or applique scissors. If you have one of the small little irons, you can press it right there in the hoop. You would, of course, want some heat-resistant padding under that, making sure that you don't do that on your machine with the heat and the materials of your embroidery machine. And then you would return the hoop to the machine and stitch out the finishing outline stitch. Traditionally, that is a satin stitch, but for a more contemporary look, a run or bean stitch is used, and the applique fabric is left as a raw edge, as you see over here. Perfect Embroidery Pro also offers us a blanket stitch, or an E-stitch actually, and motif stitches that we could work. If your applique had a second applique on it, as this little guy does, the same process is going to stitch out the applique position. You place your prepared fabric over that. It stitches the tack down applique stitch. You would then remove the hoop and trim close to that, and then put the hoop back on the machine and finish with any other decorative stitching that is required for that design. At the end, you end up with a cute little design such as this, and this is just an easy way to either present a gift to someone or to do some things with your practice stitch outs, an inexpensive mat board with some fun things glued. In our Perfect Embroidery Pro screen, we're going to begin with an easy artwork shape, the triangle. I'll come up here to Artwork, choose my triangle, and I'll click and drag a triangle on the screen. With my Select key, I'll then come over and right-click, come down to Convert to, and all the way down to Applique. I like my 3D on so you can see your stitches, and here we have an applique design. It's as easy as that. Whatever shape you might have, right-click, Convert to, Applique. Take a look over in Sequence View, and I'm going to expand the plus sign. When I do that, you see that there is really only one component to this applique, yet we just saw in the slides that there really are three levels: the applique position, the tack down, and the finishing stitch. let me show you what this looks like right here in our slow redraw. I'll click on that, and I'm just going to drag this bar across slowly. And you see there's a blue stitch, and then another blue stitch, and then at some point the satin stitch starts and finishes. Now, we see everything in the same color as blue. So there is something that we can do right away in the properties that will help us differentiate between those three levels. Having clicked on Appliqué, my properties for that appliqué become active, and the thing we're going to do right away is put a check mark right here in Change Colors, and remember we have to apply whenever we change a property. Now if I come back to Slow Redraw, do you see the difference here? We have the blue line, which is the appliqué position, then the red line, which is the tack down, and then it starts with our blue satin stitch. So by putting that check mark in this box right here, we have the two differences in our position and tack down. And I did just a close-up of that, the blue line here being our applique placement to indicate where the fabric should go, and the red line here is the applique tack down. We'll come back to that in just a moment in a little more detail. Now, normally I do not approach anything I'd like to share with you by telling you what every single button does or whatever every single property might do for us. But in this case, I'm going to do this differently. I am going to walk through a good number of all of these properties because they're important to you to understand what they are offering, and it's going to make the difference between a mediocre applique and a highly successful applique when you create them and then go ahead and stitch them out. So the first thing that we want to take a look at is the type, and by default it is satin, and this is the traditional look of the finishing edge for applique. We then have the ability to play with the applique width, and by default it's 3.5 millimeter, which is a nice width as you see over here, but I can go ahead and change that. I might put in a 2.5 and apply, and you see that is narrow, or perhaps I wanted it at 3.0 and apply. This is certainly one of those properties that you could change. I'll skip down here to applique density because I feel that density and width to me go hand in hand when I'm trying to decide the look of the satin stitch. The 0.4 millimeter is a nice density. If you are going to change that, I wouldn't go down too much further, maybe a 0.35, and you'll see that that even makes a difference. When we talk about density, we are talking about how closely the threads are laid next to each other. So the smaller the number, the closer they are laid next to each other. 0.35 is probably the least that I would go down for density. We then want to talk about stitch length. As you see, the default is a 3.5, and that is a very nice stitch length, and this is one that I would caution you about changing. Think about changing this, because an interesting side effect of stitch length is stitch loft, which is the height of the thread above the fabric. And generally speaking, and tensions being equal, the shorter the stitch, the more tightly it is pulled into the fabric, so the less loft. And it is really the thread laying nicely that makes the embroidery design look good. So the stitch length would probably be the very last thing I would ever play with. I would certainly do a number of stitch outs with some of the other properties changed before I would change the stitch length. But certainly that's up to you, but you'll go in with the proper knowledge of what that's going to do. We then see that we have the ability to add a placement line and or a tack down line. By default, the check marks are there. I could remove the placement line, remove the tack down, remove both of them, but the idea is that you have the ability to leave them in or take them out. The reason why you might want to remove one or the other depends on the type of fabric that you have chosen. You might have a certain kind of fabric that you don't want the extra holes the needle penetrations or the extra thread on, such as a leather or a vinyl. When you put a hole in either one of those, that hole is going to stay there. So that is, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we do the E-stitch, but you do have the options there to work with that. The adjust holes does not come into play yet with our satin stitch. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what I would like to talk to you about is this inset percentage. And by default, it's set to 50. Let's take a look at a slide where I've given you some information about what this means. The inset right here, this first one, is the default, and the inset is 50. What is meant by the inset is how much of that satin stitch lies on the applique fabric and how much of it lies on the focus fabric. Do you notice with this one set at 50 that this satin stitch is equally divided above the blue line and below the blue line? Remember, this blue line is representing our applique position. So this default is evenly dispersed. Same amount on the applique fabric, same amount on the focus. But if we come down here and we lower the number on that inset percentage, the lower the number means the more the satin stitch will lay on the focus fabric. Okay, down in here, our red in that first picture that we saw. Look at the blue line and look at the amount of stitching that is below that into the focus fabric versus the amount of stitch that goes into the applique. The reverse is if we give it a very high number, the more the satin stitch is going to lie on the applique fabric, not on the focus fabric. Now, I've exaggerated these numbers, 25, 90, they're relatively low and high, but the thought being, once again, it depends on the type of fabric that you are using for your applique fabric and the type of fabric that the focus fabric is. If you have something of the focus fabric, let's say you have something with a high pile or thick like fleece, you might want this inset at a lower number so that more of that satin stitch is going to lay in the fleece, grab onto that heavier fleece, than it does the applique. Now, maybe you don't want to go down to 25, that's a lot, but maybe you want to drop that down to a 40 or 35. Remember that the default is 50. If you're having fabric that is, your applique fabric that is very loosely woven, then you might want to up that inset percentage so that you have more of that satin stitch on the applique fabric and not as much here. Now, again, really, this 90 is exaggerated because you can see there's very little bite of that satin stitch that is on your focus fabric. But the idea, I tried to exaggerate so you could see the difference readily. But this is your option here when you're talking about inset. It really is going to be controlled by the type of fabric that you have for both the applique and your focus fabric. We then come to, well, the pattern length is grayed out. Excuse me. But now we take a look at the angle. And the angle is the slant of the border stitches, or in this case, the satin stitches. And you'll notice that they give us a range. It can go from a -10 all the way up to the 10. For me to show you what this looks like, I'm going to zoom in quite a bit here. And I'm coming over to my ruler. I'm going to click within this ruler and drag one of my guidelines over to one of the stitches. And I'm doing this so you can see what happens when we set this angle. By default, it's set to 0. Do you notice how the top of this thread right here, this needle position right here, is directly across from this needle position right here? That's why I gave you this straight line. So visually you could follow the top of that one straight down. In other words, the needle penetrations are directly across from each other. Okay? Take a look what happens if I put in the lowest amount we're allowed to go, the -10, and I apply it. We do see an angle to the thread, but let's follow this same thread that's here on the top of this line, And if I follow that down, oops, I just moved. If I follow that down, you can see that the bottom thread needle penetration is over here and how far away I am from our original starting point up here on this line. So it has angled the thread in one direction. The reason you would want to do this is, again, if you had a loosely woven fabric, what you're doing is you're assuring that that needle penetration is not going to be right across from each other in that loosely woven, so that you're giving a little bit more strength to that stitch where it's off center. It's not going to be directly below, the needle penetrations are not directly below or above each other. Certainly if we come back to the angle and we make it the 10, you're going to see the difference. Same thing, except it slants toward the right. Again, if we follow our needle penetration down, we can see that we're off, not as much as we were with the other, but we're off from our straight line. So that is your angle. You need to make that decision based on your fabric of the applique. All right. Let's take a look at the corner type. I'll come back out here, and then I might go in a little closer so you can see this. And we're talking about the corner type right here on this triangle. You can see that the corner type is square, and by default the activation angle is 45. Okay, I might zoom in just a little bit more so you can see what's going to happen here. If we take this square and we make it an extended point, click on Apply, you can see that that's what happened. Instead of it being the squared off end, we now have the extended point. Okay, very nice point. Notice here that we have double strength on this point, where we have extra stitching going in this direction, stitching over this stitching underneath it that's going top to bottom. So we have strength in that corner. However, watch what happens when we bring that angle down to, say, a 30% and we apply it. And what's happened here, we still have an extended corner, but you no longer have the overlap of that stitching. Now, some people look at this and go, oh, but this is lovely. This is the look that I wanted, and I like that satin all the way to the corner. And that might be so, but again, you're going to have to think about if this is truly what you want. This corner is not as strong because you don't have that overlap of direction of stitches, and you run the risk of having multiple needle penetrations right in this area in here that could tear the fabric. So this is something you want to think about. You might think you want this because of the look, but this is really not as strong as the other, and you run the risk then of, if you understand pull compensation or pull, you're going to have extra pull on that corner. And if your focus fabric is not sturdy or your applique is not, you run the risk of having a situation there. So I would put that back to 45 and apply it, and you get that nice overlap, that little bit of strength right there in your point. If we go back to square and apply that, again, we have a little bit of overlap. Same thing happens. If I make that a 30 degree angle, I still get that extension, even though it's square, but it can't apply, it can't comply to what you're asking it to do with the 30% activation angle. So that puts us back into that little bit of sore spot. So again, 45 is a nice angle to stay with, which is why it's given to us. We have that little bit of overlap. So you have options on your corners. And we then talk about the placement offset and the tack-down offset. These two are important for you to understand what's happening right here, because we'll see them more than once. Let's go back to a slide that I've already prepared. I have this one stuck in the middle so you can see your square corner and extended corner. And then here is the slide with a little bit more information on it. Just to review, the blue line is the applique placement. That is the true size of this applique. The red line is representing the tack down. Okay? So when we talk about placement offset, the default is 0, meaning that this placement line will stitch directly in the position or at the size of the applique design, in this case the triangle that we have created. It's not offset, it's not moved over in any position, it is going to stitch in the original exact position. If we come over here to look at the applique tack down, the default is 25%, and what that is referring to is that distance between the blue position or placement line and the red of the actual stitching line of that tack down. We have this white area, and that's what this black arrow is supposed to indicate. This really is wiggle room. I want you to think for a moment, if we did not have this offset and it was set to 0, that means this red line would be stitching right on top of that blue line. Think of how accurate you would need to be if you already had your applique fabric cut out. This default offset is not crucial if you are doing it the traditional way, in which you lay down a larger piece of fabric, the tack down tacks it, and then you trim away, very much like I showed you in those first pictures. We have a little bit of room between where you trim away and the actual size of the applique, and we know that that satin stitch is going to cover both. However, those of you that have a digital cutter, like the Silhouette Cameo, the Brother Scan and Cut, if you have a Go cutter, and you are cutting out your applique shapes, that shape is going to be cut out to the size of this blue line, which is the actual placement. If you didn't have this offset, you would have to be dead on with your stitching and your placement of that triangle for you to stitch right on the very edge of that fabric. And that, to me, is just cutting it too close. Pun intended. So here, the default really is giving us that wiggle room between where it's going to stitch down and the actual edge of that pre-cut design. That's why those of you that are going to use your digital cutters with all of this, that's why you use the applique placement line to be brought over to the software for the Cameo and the others. You're using the blue line, not the red line. If you cut something out at the red line, it's going to be too short. So it's important that you understand what they're talking about with that offset. All right, we'll come back in and take a look at one other thing, a few things here before we move on. And this next one is working with a different type of stitching, of your outline stitching. By default, we have it set to satin. We're going to go in there and choose the E-stitch and apply that. And we get a little weird looking things going on, but only until I explain to you what you're seeing. Let's zoom in just a little bit more. What you are seeing here is this blue thread. Remember that we have the change color, so we only have the two different colors, the blue and the red. And the blue right here and the red right here are the ones that you are already familiar with, the applique position and the applique tack down. It is this blue thread right here that it is our E-stitch, and it takes the name because it looks like an E on its side, or it's facing up, but very similar to your blanket stitch on your sewing machine, in that it's going to stitch forward, go into the fabric, go back, stitch forward, take the bite, go back, stitch forward, take the bite, go back, and so forth. An E-stitch or a blanket stitch. In this case, we have a number of the same properties that are applied. You certainly can change the applique width to be the 3.5. You may remember that I changed it to a 3.0. We cannot choose the density in an E-stitch. It has to be that measurement spaced as it is. We can do an inset, and I'm going to show you why you might want to do that. If you did not want the placement line or the tack down line, you can see that if I take that out and apply, it is not going to show me where to place the fabric. If I put that back and take out the tack down line and apply, you can see that it took out. You also see that it changed some colors there for me. But in this case, we're going to use both of them so I can talk to you about the choices that you have here. And the other thing that I'd like to do, you have the option under our properties, our second one, commands, to come down here to fabric, use the ellipse button, and we're brought into lots of different fabric swatches, and there really are many, 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 many. If you opened up the Batiks, if you opened up the Modas, and you see how just tons of them to choose from. But I'm going to stay right here on this first screen just because it's easier. We'll bring in the orange, and that helps you see a little better what's going to happen and where it's going to happen. If this were me, and I actually were going to stitch this E-stitch, and I did have orange fabric, so that my applique tack down thread did not show, I would make that thread be the same color as my applique fabric, or very close to it, to make it look tonal. In this case, if I right-click on the turquoise to change the actual E-stitch color, it also changed the color thread of the tack down to orange, the one that follows it, so you can see that that's going to blend in better. Okay? Now, the other thing here, and this is what this E-stitch will do by default. You see all this white space. This is exactly how it will stitch. There is going to be distance between your fabric and the bar of the E-stitch. This is, if you like that look, you're already set and you don't have to worry about anything. But if you don't want all of that white space in there between your stitch, and you want a bigger bite into the applique fabric, then we're going to come up here to our inset, and this is one of the times you might want to run it up. I'm going to make that my 90 and apply, and you see now that I have that bar of the E-stitch closer to the fabric, and even if I wanted to run that up to a 95% inset, then it's going to give a little thin line there, and the bite of the E is into my applique better. That happens to be my preference if I'm going to use an E-stitch, but the software, it's not just for one person, it's for many, so you have lots of options how you would like yours to look. You have one other thing when we talk about E-stitch, and I'll bring us out just a bit to create something and then zoom us back in, but it's this ability to adjust the holes. I'll go ahead and come up here and get my triangle again. I'll draw a new triangle, and then I'm going to get my ellipse and draw a circle in the middle there. Select that circle, bring it more into the middle, and with the circle selected, I'm going to hold down my control key and select the triangle as well. So I have both of those pieces of artwork. You can see them right over here in sequence view. I'm going to come up to the toolbar and do a combine. When I do that, it now treats those two pieces as one unit. You can see that down here in the artwork. Now when I choose this artwork, right-click, convert to Applique, it does just that, goes back to the default with the satin. Let's do a down arrow and choose the E-stitch and apply, and let's go get, certainly want to change my colors, and let's go get a piece of fabric so you can see this a little better. Double-click and put that in, and I'll zoom in so you can see just a bit better. But with this center hole, we have the same situation as we did over here with our original triangle. So I probably would come up here and make that inset my 95%, apply that, and I would change my color so that my tack down was yellow. That would fade into my fabric so I didn't see it as much. And at this point, use what we're really wanting to look at. And for the moment, I'm just going to take out that tack down so you can see it. Do you see the bite of your E-stitch coming in here to the fabric? But when we get to the circle, the bite of that E-stitch is coming into the focus fabric. If that's what you're after, all you have to do is leave it as is. But if you want that bite to come back into the applique fabric, come over here and put a check mark in your adjust holes, click on apply, and then you have the bite of that E-stitch going back into the applique fabric. which might be the look that you prefer. But you have an option. Again, everyone can do it the way that they like it to be. So that's with our E-stitch. We'll come back here and play with our orange one. And the other thing, too, you may remember that I brought that guideline over for you to see the stitch. If ever you want to take that off the screen, all I have to do is come over to the ruler, right-click in the ruler, ask it to remove the guideline, and now I'm back with just a clean background for myself. So in this case, we have the E-stitch. Another option that you have is Motif. If I click on Motif, the default is that number 100, and you see it come in. This particular pattern length, the pattern length now becomes available to us because we're working with Motif. The 6 is a little large, so if I bring that down maybe to a 4 and apply it, you can see that it gives you a different look. It does cover the edge, but you have some opening on that. So you're going to have a little bit of raw edge showing just as you would with your E-stitch. You certainly could play with different looks that you might like and apply. You could play with the pattern length and so forth. And I'll show you one that I like a lot that's not quite as open as the others. It's down here, 181. If I choose 181 and apply, I like that. It looks to me a little bit more like lace, and if you had some fabric that might fray easier than others, then you might want more of that type of motif look to cover up those raw edges a little bit more. We also have one last option with our type, and that is symbol. If we go into our ellipse, you might remember this catalog of symbols. We've played here before when we did our sandals in the July webinar. We'll go ahead and double click on the asterisk and apply it. Now that comes in very large. It comes in as a size 10, so I probably would see what half of that looked like at a 5 and apply, and that looks even better. You certainly could go back in. There are many, many different symbols. One that I think that gives us a very unusual look is this checkerboard, and if we apply that, you can see the look that you have on that edge as well. So really, it's unending. Your fun can go on forever. It's just the look that you might want to work with or to play with at that point. Dory, I'll pause there for any questions that might have come our way.
Super. One of the many questions that came in was, we saw that you flipped your applique teeth going from the inside to the outside of the circle. Can you apply that same concept to the outside of the triangle as well?
Not to my knowledge. Thinking of which choices we have here.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge. No.
All right. Well, that's definitely a challenge. Like a good challenge.
Yes.
Okay. Now, one of the other questions is, when you adjust the stitch length, do you have to adjust the stitch width? I should say the length and the width.
Yes, but the question is starting with changing the length. If I change the length, do I have to change the width?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How can a stitch be 3.5 millimeters long when the satin column width is 3.0? It's the stitch length of the tack down, correct?
This stitch length here?
Yes. That would be the stitch length of the tack down. Am I correct?
I believe you are, yes.
Okay, good. Okay.
Thank you, Dory. Yeah.
All right. That's what we had here. And okay. Last but not least, when you're doing an applique, a piece of fabric that you put on there, sometimes the fabric shrinks or appears to shrink. It doesn't really. What is your rule of thumb as far as how much fabric bigger than the area that you wish to cover? Do you do it twice the amount?
I normally will go, and whenever I write my instructions in the magazine articles or anything, I will always give uh, a nice amount extra, a 1 inch bigger than what that applique piece might be, because I don't know if that was a beginner reading that article or could be an advanced person, and certainly someone who is very familiar with applique might be able to put a smaller piece in, maybe only a 1/2 inch wider and longer than the applique piece requires. However, if you prepare your fabric with some kind of fusible webbing to the back, you won't have as much of that draw in because the fabric itself is stabilized as well as the stabilizer that you're using in your hoop.
Ah, okay. That makes so much sense. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, we'll go ahead then, clean screen. With a good understanding of those properties, we're going to play a little bit now with creating different kinds of appliques. You have a number of them built into the software. If you take a look up here on your text designs, with our drop-down arrow, we click on the drop-down arrow and we have applique shapes available to us. There are 152 of these fun shapes already in the catalog, so you can start with any of those to get comfortable with your applique. We'll just use these dog bones right here. Certainly you could click once and click on OK, or we could do a double click and bring it to the screen. If I turn on my 3D, that's all you needed to do. Anything in those applique shapes will automatically come into the screen for you as an applique with the satin stitch, with the defaults of 3.5 and density and so forth. You certainly could go to this point and go get some fabric to take a look at your color scheme, perhaps, whatever it is that you wish to do, but that's how easy it is. It's pretty much all done for us. We still could go into this applique. I still could do the change colors. I do that. That's a personal thing that I do. You might decide you don't do it as often, but generally that'll be the first thing that I do if I'm playing with applique, because I want to make sure that I have those colors that I can differentiate if I need to. You could stop here and just have a very good time, or we can go up here to text, click anywhere on our screen. I'll go ahead and type in our first little puppy's name, Gus. I can come into the font catalog by clicking on that white window. I know the one I want. It's up here. It's one of my favorites, the Benquid. And I bring that in. I'm going to right-click on the orange to change the color. Come over here and get my select key because I like to drag the word to size visually. I'm going to bring that back over here. I know I need to size it a little bit more. And then, of course, I need to rotate it. And that rotate button allows me to be precise with my rotation. And I can place that where I'd like it. And then once again, I'll put in for our other little puppy. And we'll pretend that we have a Bella. Again, clicking on that white box puts me into the catalog of our fonts. And I'll go with Bauhaus. I like that one. Looks like it comes in large, but it doesn't really. If I back out to a 200, and I will size or give her a color as an aqua, get my select key, size this down a bit, drag her over into her area, rotate that, position it as I'd like, rotate again a little bit more to get it straight, and if I zoom out, we now have an applique that has been personalized. And certainly we can do that with any applique, but I did this to bring to your attention your sequence view, because it is very important when you are working with applique that you make sure the order of stitch out is what it should be. And in this case, we created the applique first, which would take care of laying the fabric down and trimming and doing our finishing satin stitch. And then the word Gus will stitch out on our fabric, and the word Bella will stitch out on our fabric. So in this case, the way that we created this applique is the proper stitch out order. We're going to do one in just a moment here where we thought of something in between and the order is incorrect, so we need to change that. But this is an easy place to start, an easy applique. You've personalized it, and we've made sure that our stitch out order is correct. So at this point, we'll take a look, clean screen, and we're going to take a look at another type of finish for the edge of your applique, and it is called raw edge. Both of these clocks, if any of you get the Dime magazine, these were in the last issue, the July-August issue clocks that I did, both of which are showing you raw edge applique. I'll zoom in on this just a little bit so you can see a bit better what I'm talking about. When we talk about raw edge, it is where the fabric edge is not overcast with a satin or all-encompassing stitch. And there are only two steps when you do a raw edge applique. You still have your applique position, and then the tack down becomes a bean stitch, and there is no third satin or finishing stitch. As you look here on the white, I'm talking about this straight black line that outlines the number unit here, and you can see the raw edge of the white. If you come up here on the 5, you can see it better where the black bean stitch is stitched around those numbers, and I've trimmed away around the numbers themselves. It's also done on the 7 and 6. You just can't see it as easily. Here's another example of raw edge applique. This is a standalone situation, but all of these that I've created where the ornament top, and then this is sort of like a 3D. They are done on the embroidery, but they're done in such a way that you trim about a quarter, not quite a quarter of an inch away from your bean stitch, and that gives more detail to the outside of those. And then we have, you can see here that the bill and the feet do not have a lot of embroidery on there, but it just is fun and it's whimsical, and it doesn't have to be a full-blown fill stitch like these eyes are to have this look. Now when you do raw edge, you do need to think of the fabric that you're going to use for this look. All of the gold and the green here for these leaves are batik, and this green and this white are a tightly woven cotton. And when I do raw edge like this, I absolutely use a pre-treatment with that fusible webbing on the back side. I like the look of raw edge. Most of what I do for myself is raw edge. I very much enjoy playing with and the look of fiber. So to me, this raw edge just adds to that fiber, and if there's a little bit of fraying, I don't mind that. I do respect that some people just don't care for it. However, my job is to give you inspiration as well as education, something you may not have done before. So we are going to do a raw edge. And in each of these baby quilts that I've done, all of these are done with raw edge. And if I zoom in just a little bit, you might be able to see some of the texture that's on this raw edge. I usually do that as well, and I'm going to show you how I do that and explain to you why I do it. So we'll come back into our clean screen, and we're actually going to create that JMA that was on that quilt. So we start by coming up here to File, Import True Type Text. Because it was a baby blanket, I used lowercase letters, JMA, and at the time, my little grandson, not born yet, but they weren't sure on his first name, but they knew it was going to start with a J. They knew the middle name, and they, of course, knew the last name, so I was able to do monogram instead of his name, which worked out all right. He is now Jamie, so that works out well. And I know that I'm after the Ravi, so I'll go ahead and OK that and bring that to screen. This is artwork. You may remember that it is artwork. I'll drag it to the center screen here, and I'm going to size the characters up a bit, and then I'm going to start playing with them individually. So for the M, I'm going to rotate it, and I made it much smaller than the J and the A because this being the middle name. I can drop that in there and play with the size as I see fit. And then the J and the A, I left that larger, and I could rotate that as much or as little as I'd like. But what you may be noticing is that I am purposely overlapping these letters right here. Before I go any further, this J is one unit with the J and the dot on the top is one unit. I am going to break those two apart. Right click, break apart, or I could have done it over here on the toolbar. I'll explain to you when we get more towards the end of this why I did that, but for the moment now those are separated and the J is selected. I'll hold down the control key to select the M, and I'm going to come back up here to weld. Those of you that have been with me before know that I like this key, and it makes that J and M one unit. You can see that it's taken off the line here, and since the M is overlapping the A and the J and the M are now considered one unit, I'll hold a control down and click on the A, come back up here to weld, and it does just that. So now the JMA is one unit, and we see over here with our artwork, that's one unit, and then the top of the J is the other unit. All right, in raw edge, we still need the applique position. So I'm going to select all items, right click, convert to a run. I'm not using the automatic applique because that will give me my 3 levels with a satin stitch. So in this case, I'm creating a run stitch, and I forgot to come over here to the transform. I know that I want this at a 3.5. So the whole thing, actually no, I think maybe a 4.5. The whole thing I want to be larger. Okay, and bring that back in. Okay, so we have made the first layer of our applique a run stitch, which is the applique position. It's going to stitch out to show us where we're going to put that fabric over those letters. Now, we don't have the 3 levels, we just have the 2 levels. So the second level or second layer will be both the tack down and the decorative. It's going to be a bean stitch. So I'm going to do a copy and a paste, and it laid the second one right on top of the first. I'll change the color to orange, and I'm going to come up here and say standard bean, and I could leave it at 3 or I could make it a 5, whatever I'd like to do, and apply that. I'll come over here to the 3D so you can see it a little better with the thicker bean stitch. So technically at this point that would create a raw edge applique. The stitch out that shows us our placement, if we do our slow redraw, it'll stitch out our placement to show us where we put our fabric, and then we've laid the fabric over it, and it's tacking down all of that with a decorative bean stitch, and then we would trim away the excess fabric. So technically we're finished. However, since this is raw edge on a baby blanket, a blanket that will have many washings, I want to assure that the fabric, this applique fabric, will be well adhered to the quilt and decorative. So I'm going to add a layer of a motif pattern. Let's take a look back at that. Do you see where you have a little crosshatch going on all of these letters? This is what we're going to add to our layer of raw edge for 2 reasons. First, because I like the look. It adds more texture to that, but it's also going to help us anchor the fabric to the quilt through all of those washings. So what we need to do, please remember that we've already done a copy because we did the copy of the blue and the paste. So really all I need to do is paste again, and I have added another blue layer, so right away I'm going to change that to purple, so right click on purple, and it has laid that 3rd layer on top. It is a standard because that's the first one we copied. I want to change this now, so a right click, convert to, and I'm going to come down to complex fill. That might sound funny at the moment. I've made an applique that has fill stitch in it, but let's come over here to our standard and choose the drop down for standard, and instead I want the motif, and the motif that I want is number 103. I know that I want that at a 6 pattern size, pattern length, and apply it. And when I do, it gives me that crosshatch look over all of the fabric. The last thing we need to do, this is the one where in our thinking process, we did not create it in the order that we wanted to stitch out. If you take a look over here at your sequence view, the blue is just the run stitch, just standard 3.0 stitch length. If we do the orange layer, which was our second one, it is the bean. It is this layer that needs to stitch out last. We need this motif, this crosshatch, to stitch out second. So what we can do is select this orange and come up to our toolbar and ask it to move to front, which puts it last in line. So now even when we look at our picture, we can tell that this is going to stitch out correctly. The blue, again, we'll go through our slow redraw. So your applique position, we lay down our fabric. The tack down really is the decorative cross hatching, and then we get the tack down decorative, which is our bean stitch, which is the final stitch. So that now is going to stitch out properly. The reason why I broke the dot away from the J in the very beginning was when I actually did this, I did not break them apart. I didn't on my practice stitch out. And if this is a part of the J and the M and the A, the way this crosshatch stitches out is unusual because it'll do part of it down here, goes up and does part of it, comes down here and does part, goes back up here, does part. So there was a number of times where it went back on itself. If I did a break apart, then it does this top of the J, the dot, all by itself, and then comes back here and does all the crosshatch in the order that it needs to. So that was the thought behind this one. All right, when we're talking about raw edge, I'll show you another choice that you have, a clean screen. This time I'm going to open an existing embroidery design that I have, and this is a leaf down here on the design tab. Notice it's Creations by Kara. I named it that way so you could tell where I got this particular design. Creations by Kara is a real good friend to Dye Magazine. She advertises almost all the time in the magazine. She has lovely things, so you can take a look through your magazine at her site. But here is the leaf. And what we want to do, this is just plain embroidery that you would embroider on a jacket or a table runner, or wherever you'd like to place this. But in doing one thing, we can turn this into more of a raw edge standalone applique. My trick then here is to select it, right click, come down to create outline. You know that we've done this many times. We've done it for different reasons. This time, where I normally just put in a 0 for the distance, I am going to actually put in higher than what's suggested. I'm going to put in the 0.1. Everything else remains default. I'll OK that, and you see that it puts a line outside of the embroidery design. If we right-click, the red is selected. If we right-click and convert that to a run, I come in here and choose my favorite bean, and I could make it a 3 or a 5 repeat. I'll go ahead and apply. You can see that it stitches around that design. Now, let me show you what we can do with that. Here's a picture. It's a sunflower that a group of my friends and I got together for a little challenge, and we did this. But here is that leaf design as a standalone applique, and you can see that run stitch right there. What that does is allow me to trim, as I said, just about a 1/4 inch away from your bean stitch. You trim away. You would actually embroider this. You would hoop up your fabric. The green fabric would be hooped with a water-soluble stabilizer so that when the embroidery was finished, I can trim away on the outside of that bean stitch, and then should there be any stabilizer left, I simply can wash that away, and that allows that leaf to stand alone. You can see there's another one. There was actually one in each corner. And quite honestly, for all of these petals, I did the same thing to all of them. These were designs that I just drew using our artwork tool, the ellipse, and changing it more from a circle to an oval. And then in these, I did just a plain outline of a leaf, but this particular stitch, if you followed it all the way to its ending, is open, so I could insert a little piece of florist wire on each of these leaves and bend it ever so slightly to give it a bit of dimension look. But right here you see your green leaf. That's the one that we have on our screen right here. And the way that I was able to do that again was just to right-click, create the outline, and set that outline stitch about 0.1 away from the embroidery. Okay, Dory, do we have any other questions at this point?
No, most of them have been answered by the moderators, but I do have one quickie.
Okay, doke.
How do you add an extra piece of, in this particular case, an extra layer of the leaf? If you wanted to, say, put on a piece of sheer, Twilight Twinkle?
Are you talking about under the actual embroidery itself? So you had more of a mylar look to it?
Yes, just a little sparkly.
Okay, that, if you were going to do that to this design is a one-colored applique, and it is not, at the moment, it does not have an applique position to it, so we wouldn't know where to place the design. So what we could do, instead of having, I'm going to delete this red one, okay? So I'll select that and delete, we'll start fresh. So here's our design. If I wanted to make this, again, to add applique fabric underneath this opening, I would do a right-click, create the outline, and have the distance set to 0, and OK that. Okay, now that is the exact same size of the embroidery. So this I would right-click it, convert it to my run stitch, and that becomes my applique position. Okay, and then at that point you would lay your twinkle or organza, again, a bigger piece, maybe just to make sure, because you're dealing with organza, I probably would cut it that inch larger than what I need. And then, just to be safe, I would do a copy paste of that same outline. I'll just change it a different color so that we can see that color. And then this color would be, or this would be a stitch length 3 standard, and that's going to be our tack down. You could even come in here and make that a 2-ply so that it would run twice around to tack down that organza. But now here's our situation again, the habit that you want to get into. If you have done this, look at the order of stitch out. We do not want the pretty green embroidery to stitch out first. We need that to stitch out last on top of the organza. So at this point, we would come up here and ask it to move to front, which really puts it in last in the stitch out line. So now our red becomes our applique position. Okay, so now at that point, we lay our larger piece of organza or twinkle over that red, and then we would stitch down the tack down, which is that teal color. So now the organza is in place, and we would remove the hoop and trim close to the edge of that applique, and then you could finish out the embroidery, which is going to stitch all on that edge.
Terrific. Okay. Terrific. Yep. Thank you.
So yes, and that was a great question, because that shows you how you can turn almost anything into an applique. Almost anything. You might, to be perfectly honest, you might want this red and blue layer to be off just a little bit. You might want that sized where I left it at a 0. You might want it at a
Maybe a
let's see,
-1?
yeah, I was going to say a -1, or we could do an inside.
Inside. Yes.
Yep, we could do the inside, so it's just a hair off of that. So when you trim your trim, now that wasn't correct, I hit the OK instead, but then your trim would be under that
Yep.
nice stitching on that leaf. That's probably what I would do, is bring it in just a hair.
And I think that should
And
be
because you
required.
can, yeah, and because you can, if we sort of take the eyeball off of those, because you can, if you did not want this stem, because this is art, we can go into our shape and we can do those lines here. We simply could start by coming in here, deleting all of those lines and applying, and get rid of that stem because you don't need any organza under the stem, and then your organza could just be in the body of the leaf as well before you did your copy and paste of that. Yep. So there would be some other things that you could think about. That great question, because you can apply that look.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Okay, at this point there was a couple other things to show, but I'll just show you our ending picture. You have the ability, this one came in from artwork, when you do your import artwork with a design. This was actually in 3 pieces. You can also put an applique onto a filled stitch. We've done this here with your raw edge and so forth. We've done this before in previous webinars where we do a split with your applique design. This cat is part of those free 152 applique designs. So you have other options with your applique. It really is, I will definitely come back to it in other webinars because I love applique. You can do so much with it. But lots of opportunity to play here. So of all of the things that you have seen, I hope that I've showed you a number that were pleasing to you.
And
one other little,
yes, ma'am.
You're welcome. Dory, if I can take just one moment,
Sure.
I would like to thank everybody for joining me this evening, but just to remind you that I will be presenting another webinar this month. It's unusual. We normally only do one a month in each of the software packages, but we're adding a second webinar on Tuesday, September 29th, that is on the new Word Art and Stitches, that will be going over the bubble text and all of the fun that you can have there. So perhaps we will play together again on that date. Thank you, Dory. Thank you, everyone, for joining me this evening.
Good night.